What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the tower. Today, I just want to have a discussion about hybrid and kind of where it is right now. And then a few changes I think that could be made to it that would help a lot. So yeah, let's get into it. Currently, the main use of hybrid is only used for overcharge enemies. Health is a lot less viable for all the other enemies, just because of how overcharge are designed. As you can see here, they deal way less damage than any of the other enemies. I think this is around 65,000 times less than the wave damage. And Overcharge are really strong. They just sit outside your tower range and start shooting projectiles at you. And they do it pretty quickly, so if you don't actually have the EHP, then it's really deadly. And I assume that's by design. They just wanted to make the enemy really strong so that it's really hard to counter with the glass cannon. So they're trying to force you to actually have some EHP for them. And their attack does double every hit, but it's additively. So it pretty much would just add 1.26 onto every hit. Here, the first hit would be 1.26 trillion. The second would be around 2.5. And then the third would be like 3.7 something. Scaling additively like that. So it's not actually too deadly. Other than Overcharge, it's not super viable to use EHP for other enemies. There is some cases where you can use like Chain Thunder and stuff for some enemies like Rays and ranged enemies. But in the higher tiers and legends, that's pretty niche. It's not going to be used that much. And you do need really good EHP to even do that. So that's kind of where hybrid currently stands. Just used for one enemy for the most part. But there are definitely some problems with it that can make it underwhelming in a lot of situations. Sometimes it can even be bad to actually use health. And in those situations, using glass cannon actually gives you more waves. So the first problem I want to talk about is the fact that Overcharge actually break all your energy shields before your tower health. So for an example of this, Overcharge currently do 2 trillion damage, and as you can see, I have way more than enough health. If I let this play, the Overcharge will actually take my shields. So it's currently just taking my shields away, even though I have way more than enough health to actually tank the shots. And as you can see, when it's actually shooting me, it's barely doing any damage. It's doing very little, around 5 trillion. So I essentially just lost all of my energy shields for nothing, since I could easily tank all these shots. And this actually becomes a big problem in a lot of cases. I think this is the main thing that makes hybrid a lot worse or a lot more niche in the current version. Since, like I said, Overcharge are really the only enemy you're using the health for. It will take all your shields away, which leaves you vulnerable to any of these other enemies. And losing all those shields can cause you to die to any of these other enemies, since all it will take is one hit, instead of having 3 extra with the energy shields. Ideally, the change I think they should make is just so that Overcharge start by hitting your actual tower health before the energy shields. It would actually be a win-win for both builds, hybrid and glass cannon. Since for glass cannon, it won't really affect much, and in some cases it could even be good if you unknowingly have enough health to tank like 1 or 2 hits from an Overcharge. They would take all your shields away and you have no chance to get any death defies. The main thing the death defies are for is the Berserker Mastery, where you get an extra 62 times damage for 300 seconds if you are at max level, which allows you to kill them a lot quicker. And why it's good for hybrid, it won't ever actually use your energy shields unless you really need them. So if the Overcharge took all your health away, and you don't have enough to tank their shots anymore, you can still roll a death defy on all 3 of the energy shields while being a hybrid build, which is not normally the case. Currently, it would just take all your shields away and then start taking your health away. And then the last hit will be the only chance you get for a death defy. So I think this would be the biggest change to make hybrid better. It would just make everything easier, and it would make hybrid a lot more efficient and effective. One other harmful interaction for hybrid is between the wall and then the actual tower health. For example here, the Overcharge can just keep shooting my wall, and it will do more damage every hit from 2 things. From the damage doubling that the Overcharge already does by itself, and the heat up of 4% every hit. So the Overcharge will do more and more every hit on my wall. And one of the problems with this is if my wall breaks, then it does keep its new damage on my actual tower. So it will be dealing way more damage than it usually would if my wall was broken. Since the wall does less thorns damage than the actual tower, and it can take a lot more hits of thorns from the wall. I don't think this is as big of a problem, but I could definitely see the viability of reducing your wall health on purpose so that this doesn't happen. And I don't really think the developers want that to be a thing. They want every stat to matter in this game. So I think a way to fix this would be giving the wall and the tower their own kind of heat up mechanics, instead of it just being based on the enemy. So for example, every time the wall gets hit by the same enemy, it will do 4% more damage to the wall. And same with the Overcharge's damage doubling. If they would be independent of each other, I think that wouldn't be a problem. Another big problem right now is how much damage the enemies actually deal in the higher tiers. So I'm just going to go through the last 4 tiers and show the starting damage, just so you can see how much it actually scales in the last tiers. So for tier 18, the enemies start with 1.32 trillion, which is of course going to be way less for the overcharge. On tier 19, they start with 344 trillion. On tier 20, they start with 82 small Q. And on tier 21, they start with 19, almost 20 big Q actually. So as you can see, this number scales extremely fast as you go up in the tiers. So for these last 2 tiers, I really don't think it's viable to use hybrid at all, since the enemy damage just starts way too high and it scales way too fast. And I think for it to be viable at all, we either need new sources of EHP or health multipliers, or just reducing the scaling for the enemy damage on these tiers. I think either of those would work. And I have a few other points here that I think could help with these tiers. The first one being where we get the sources of our EHP from. So in version 27, they added a Primordial Collapse as the first banner to come out. And this is one of the big new sources of EHP. If you have the Ancestral Rarity, you get an 80% damage reduction on enemies while they're inside Black Hole, which is a really nice extra damage reduction that does help with hybrid. The problem with it is that you have to have it slotted in instead of something that helps Glass Cannon. So you're actually losing value on your damage by using this for hybrid. Since right now in the game, damage is by far the best. And a lot of the time, it's not really going to be worth it to lose some of your things that help with damage for EHP. I think this is the main example of this. But another thing could be maybe substats, since we have a limited amount of substat slots. And there are some EHP substats, but a lot of the time they don't really fit. I do have a defense percent here, but I can't really make that fit on my primary module. So it makes it a lot harder to actually invest in EHP for the hybrid. I think if the sources of EHP were all sort of separate and don't actually affect the damage side of your build, I think it would be a lot more viable as well. Another thing that I think would help is with the Chain Thunder lab. So Chain Thunder can reduce enemy damage by up to 90%. At max level, you need to deal 54% of the enemy's health in Chain Lightning damage to get the full max reduction on them. And the problem with this is that it's only viable for a few enemy types. And the reason that it's only viable for a few enemy types is that most of the time you will be using Chain Lightning Plus to actually deal that damage consistently enough for the damage reduction. And at max level, this does 60% of the wave HP to enemies. So that's just more than enough to actually give you the reduction. The problem is the enemies need to have the same or lower than the wave health for you to actually get the full damage reduction out of it. So the current wave health is 9.730, and as you can see, the basics, fasts, range, protectors, and rays are the only ones that actually have similar or lower health than the wave health. And of course, the main enemy for hybrid is the Overcharge, and they have way more than the wave health. They actually have 20 times the wave health, so you're really not getting much reduction out of the Chain Thunder for them, which I think is a big problem, since it takes a lot of investment to actually get it to this point. And like I said, you also need the stones from the Chain Lightning Plus. So it's a very high amount of investment, but you don't actually get much out of it for the Overcharge. I think the thing they could do to change this would be to, instead of basing it on the enemy's max health, just base it on the wave health. As long as you can do 54% of the wave health to the enemy with Chain Lightning, then you can get the max reduction. That would make Chain Lightning Plus a lot more consistent, and it would then be viable on every enemy type, and the investment would actually be worth it. So I think all the changes I just mentioned would be extremely helpful in making hybrid not only viable everywhere, but also the strongest type of build to use. Since I know the developers want every stat to matter in the end, and they have slowly been working on that through the years. And sort of going along that, one last thing I think that could be changed is how health regen works. So right now, health regen just regens a certain amount of your health per second. And of course, we have a ton of things that buff it, like using wall regen with wall fortification to actually use the regen for the wall. The only problem with this is that we keep getting more health multipliers in the game to multiply your max health, but there isn't really anything for actual health regen anymore. Not recently, at least. So the higher your actual max health, the less the regen will actually be able to keep up with it, and actually regen your wall or your tower health, depending on what modules you're using. One idea I thought of is reworking health regen so that it's percentage based instead of just a certain number of regen. The number would definitely have to start really low since there's a lot of other things to buff how much it regens. But I think if the numbers were tweaked correctly, health regen would be a lot more viable than it currently is. I know it can be good with both the health regen and the second wind mastery, but it's really niche still, and it's still getting less effective as time goes on with the new additions we have to health multipliers. Like the most recent one we got is the change to assist mods, making them multiplicative. We get a big boost from tower health from both of our armor modules multiplying together. And we really didn't get anything for health regen. So balancing it in a way to where it's percentage based on a percentage of your health, I think it would be a lot more viable option to include in your build. I don't know the exact numbers that would make it not too good, but also not too bad. But every source of regen would have to get reworked, like the wall regen, the health regen substats, and stuff like that. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me know what you think of hybrid in the current version and where it's at. I think a lot of the changes I mentioned would be good for the state of hybrid, or just EHP in general. And yeah, that's pretty much it. See ya.